All right, this is the audio commentary for To the Moon, On the Moon, and Found. These are the first 3 books ever, cricket books, created in 1976. Sometime along the way, I decided to put all the issues together in these little pouches I created because so that people could read them in the correct order. Because once I got quite a few amassed, they would be all together and they would get mixed up, and you didn't. The people that were reading them didn't know which one came next and which ones went together. So this is the original trilogy of To the Moon, On the Moon, and Found. I don't know what the idea behind them were. I'll have another video talking about the development of the book itself and the layout, how that worked. There'll be a link in the description when I get that video completed. But we'll talk about the actual construction of these booklets. But this is the very first one ever created that started the series. So of course the first one is To the Moon, and the second one's On the Moon, and then you have Found, the 3-part series. These books almost invariably are created in a stream of consciousness. There was no idea when I started this book that there would be part 2 and part 3. The story just started and it went where it needed and then came to a conclusion when it needed. So there was no outline or layout or anything. The story just had an idea for the story. I started the story. I would say 99% of the time I didn't really know how the story was going to end. I just started the story and then it came together as it was created. So you'll see in some of the other books how this probably wasn't the best way to come up with a story, because sometimes the story will end abruptly, or it'll have loose ends that weren't tied up. So let's start with To the Moon. And one interesting thing about the very first, this was like probably fourth grade, I think, is when these were started in '76, is this extruded text. And you'll see this on most of the very first books that followed this. They all used this extruded text as a part of the artwork. And so here's the first one, and as you can see, this one actually starts backwards. They probably should have started this way, where you have more pages. But I'll discuss that in the video about the books themselves, the construction of the books. But you can see this starts, and this story is kind of gleaned from my remembrances of, I was born in '66, so I actually saw some of the moon landings and spacecraft, the liftoff of the spacecraft from launch pads, and then the return. So this is some of that, drawing on some of that I saw on television. In fact, I was mad one day because I didn't get to see the Flintstones. Didn't come on one afternoon because they were broadcasting the return of the astronauts. So I did see some of that's incorporated in the idea of this book. So you can see they go through the different stages, and amazed at the. And this one doesn't take advantage of adding the extra pages. I developed that later, where I figured out I could tear this at the top, cut this at the top, and it would give me 2 extra pages, actually 4 extra pages, because I do it on both sides. So, and this is pretty simple, just maybe mostly just pictures. And one thing specifically about this series is there's not a lot of dialogue. There's a lot of short dialogue. And so we come to the end of the first book, and we're already set up for part 2. And that's To the Moon. And we have On the Moon. Has a pretty similar cover. And this is the first one where I decided, I get extra pages if I just cut it at the top. So here we have our astronauts landed on the moon, and of course there's a mishap. He loses his little rock collector, and it hits a moon monster on the head that actually comes out of him. You can see the one-liner text here, it's look out, run, get in, dead end. And almost always the boxes for the comic panels are always free-handed. I hardly ever used a straight edge. And hopefully this was apparent to the reader that, they take off their packs and they float up into space because they're no longer weighed down by their packs. Now, I don't know if there's enough gravity. I guess there's enough gravity to keep you on the surface without floating up, but that was my idea, that they had to be weighed down by their packs to keep them from floating out into space. While they're floating in space, another space creature attacks them, and they escape. And there's a little discussion about what this was, and some made-up creature I came up with. How he saw this in a book, who knows? I guess in this world there is a space creature called a long-necked lure. So he tells him about his wisdom and space monsters. And then with this setup of the book, you have the return to the back page, and of course there's nothing on this page. I didn't feel this warranted any more exposition, so you're sent on to the next part 3, the third in the trilogy. And here's Found. Will they ever be found? Somewhere along the way, a rip developed. As these books were handed around and passed around to show people, let them read them. A rip developed, and this is one of the reasons why you should always use non-acidic tape. This is some very cheap cellophane tape, and you can see the results of that. Yellow. This is of course, the third book, and here I began to develop this. I don't know, what do you call it? A manifest page, I would assume you call it, where we have the copyright information, sort of like the inside page of a book where you have the copyright information. And so this began to develop right away. So we move into the story. They recap where they are. They're out in space and they're running out of air. They don't know if they're going to make it. Let's see if I can turn the right page. There we go. And along comes a space alien to save the day. I made up some space alien voice, so it's translated down here. course, one of the astronauts, he knows how to translate alien, which is unusual, but he knows that he says hi and can actually communicate with him. That's never established how that happens, but yeah. So here we go, and he asks him where they're going, and he can understand him, and he says, we're going back to the moon. So he says, hop in. You'll notice later on, since this was done in pencil, I was able to go back and actually do some editing, because originally this was only going to be hop in. And I think in some of, when people were reading it, they didn't quite grasp the fact that he was telling them to get in his spaceship. So later on I came back and redid that to make that a little more understandable, about that he was offering them a ride in his spaceship. So he takes them back to the moon, gives them a ride back to the moon, and they hop in their spaceship and go back to Earth. Of course, this is just a thing. And here's something happened here. You know, these, of course, you know, something was spilled on it. I kind of kept these, you know, I treasured these and kept them kind of close to my, you know, and close to myself. But I wanted other people to read them, and that was part of the reason to make them, is for other people to read the stories. But some people weren't as, did not handle them with delicate hands, and sometimes at lunch it could have been left on a table or something, and therefore it gained a stain of something wet, and you'll see that on some of my other books where they encountered some issues. So of course that's just character now. It's a stain on the book. Of course, in the story they arrive back, and this is reminiscent of the return I witnessed on TV. They got them with the battleship. Of course, they don't do that anymore, but at the time they picked them up with the battleship. And so I ended the story with the head of this just looks like the captain of the ship, or the head of the NASA Space Agency, wants to know why they didn't come back when they were supposed to come back. Why were you so late? And he says, well, that was just, it's a long story. And that concludes the end of the first trilogy. Like I said, these were created kind of a stream of consciousness, and most of the time they just kind of worked out and ended on the last page, you know, whether they, whatever the story was. So in my mind, as I was creating it, once I got close to the end, I would formulate a conclusion and bring it to a conclusion at the last page. And that's On the Moon, To the Moon and Found. In fact, later on, a few years later, I actually created a remake, a reboot, where I made a much more elaborate story. And you'll see that later on. I'll put a link in the description when that video is completed. But that's To the Moon, On the Moon and Found. If you haven't watched the book that this commentary is about, you can click here. You can click here and watch another Cricket book in the series, or you can click on this mystery box and go to something completely different. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed this. Also, links are below in the description for mobile users. Please leave a comment below and tell me what you thought of the video, or any questions you might have. Thanks.